woman, 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 women, women, women.
Right, my bad, I'll try to fix that. Anyway, welcome back to part 2 of Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel Murders. This video, episode 2, is going to specifically focus on Maryanne Nichols and the suspect Charles Allen Leechmere. Leechmere? Leechmere. Leechmere. That bird you just heard in the background was the national bird of South Africa, the hardy-daw. Now, people have accused me of being an AI voice in the past. I think that pretty much confirms I'm real, and also confirms that I am indeed South African. And like I've said before, South Africans, we tend to pronounce a lot of things wrong. Tomato, tomato, tomati, but it's just how we is, you know? So I apologize if anything is pronounced wrong in this video. Now, howtopronounce.com says it's Leechmere, so that's what I'm going to go with in this video.
Leechmere.
And for anyone watching the channel for the first time, welcome to the Freak Show. At about 3:45 in the morning of August 31st, 1888, a carman, which was basically a delivery man, named Robert Paul was walking down Bucks Row on his way to work, when he notices in the darkness that there was a suspicious man just standing on the sidewalk. This suspicious man then slowly starts approaching Robert, so according to Robert, he, quote, tried to give the man a wide berth, because few people like to come up and down here without being on their guard, for there are such terrible gangs about. There have been many knocked down and robbed at that spot. The man, however, came towards me and said, come and look at this woman, end quote. The woman laying on the ground, of course, was Maryanne Nichols, the first canonical victim of Jack the Ripper, and the man that told Robert Paul to come and look at her was Charles Allen Leechmere, a native of East London, a delivery driver, and one of the most interesting Jack the Ripper suspects. In fact, there's quite a few comments on part 1 saying, yeah, Charles Allen Leechmere, that's Jack the Ripper. One guy was even so sure that he said, quote, this whole video is hot garbage. Well, you know, that's what it takes to make it in Hollywood these days, so I guess I have a future making DC movies or something.
Kalal, no.
He goes on to say that it was obviously Charles Leechmere. Alright, great. A lot of people say the key to figuring out this case is by looking into the murder of Maryanne Nichols. So let's go over her life, her death, and the man that found her, Charles Allen Leechmere. Now, Maryanne Nichols, or Polly Nichols, as she was often called by her family and friends and acquaintances, was born Mary Ann Walker on the 26th of August, 1845. She was the second of 3 children of Edward Walker, a locksmith and blacksmith, and Caroline Walker, a laundress. When Maryanne was a teenager, she dated a boy named Thomas Stewart Drew. Now, he is important to this origin story, and we'll talk about him again later. However, this teenage romance inevitably ends, and then in 1864, when Mary is 18 years old, she meets and then marries a printer named William Nichols. By the way, I just got to mention that most of my facts and information is coming from the website jacktheripper.org, a really good website if you're interested in reading more into the Jack the Ripper case. Moving on, Maryanne then marries William Nichols in the Church of St. Bride's in Fleet Street, which is a historic street in central London, where a plaque on a wall inside the church now commemorates their union. Yes, I know, I pronounce things wrong. So the newly married couple live around this area for a while, and then they move south of the river to live with Mary's father Edward, where they would live for the next 10 years. The couple would have 5 children together named Edward John, Percy George, Alice Esther, Elizabeth Sarah, and Henry Alfred. See, people did have different names back then. Around 1875, the family moved into their own flat in the Peabody Buildings in Stamford Street, which is in the Southwark district of South London. For this, they paid a weekly rent of 5 shillings and 9 pence, which is about 34 or 35 pounds in today's money. Over the next 5 years, Mary began drinking heavily, and she also discovered that William had had an affair with the woman who looked after her when she gave birth to their last child, Henry. Yes, sis. According to Mary's father, Edward, William left Mary to live for a time with this woman, and therefore it was William's infidelity that caused the problems in their marriage. William, on the other hand, maintained that it was Mary's drinking that was responsible, and he would later state that she had left him on several occasions, and that he had only started this affair once Mary had left him. Either way, in September 1880, Mary and William separated. The kids stayed with William, with the exception of their eldest son, Edward, who went to live with Mary's father, Edward. Okay, maybe people do all have the same name then. According to Jack the Ripper org again, quote, "After him and Mary separated, William paid her a weekly maintenance allowance of 5 shillings, and by 1881, Mary became a resident of the Lambeth Workhouse, where she described herself as a charwoman. A charwoman is basically a domestic worker or housemaid. And in the UK, a workhouse was an institution where those unable to support themselves financially were offered accommodation and employment. In Scotland, they were usually referred to as poor houses." You gotta love how straightforward the Scots are. Poor bastards. Mary would live at the Lambeth Workhouse until the 31st of May 1881, when she left to move in with a man whose identity is still unknown. Around this time, William claimed to have found out that Mary was working as a prostitute. He immediately stopped paying the weekly maintenance, which would cause Mary to appeal to the Lambeth Union, who stepped in and told William, "Stop being a dick, dude, just pay her the outstanding money." He then argued that she had deserted him, leaving him to raise their children alone, and she was living with another man and earning her own money through prostitution. They presumably then said, "Shit, fam," because Mary lost the case. Now, I don't really know who did who dirty here. All we have is this he said, she said bullshit, and I'm not taking sides, I'm just presenting the story. Sooner or later though, her new relationship with this mystery man was over, and she went back to the Lambeth Workhouse for about a year. After that year is up, she then moves back in with her father Edward. Eventually he too would get rather pissed about her heavy drinking, and would even say at the inquest into her death that Maryanne was, quote, "not a sober woman." So after all the constant fighting, Mary moves out of her dad's place, moves back into the Lambeth Workhouse, and then she would rekindle her relationship with Thomas Stewart Drew. She then moves into his house and shop where he worked as a blacksmith, but ultimately this relationship would also end when Mary stole a bunch of his shit to sell it for alcohol. Damn. Now, the next bit is quite unclear, but according to jacktheripper.org again, in October 1887, Mary may have joined the hundreds of homeless who were sleeping rough in Trafalgar Square, many of whom ignored an order issued on Monday the 23rd of October by the Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren to vacate the square, and who were therefore arrested and charged with wandering abroad without any visible means of sustenance. Now, jacktheripper.org makes it clear that it's not certain whether this was the Maryanne Nichols who within a year would become the first canonical victim of Jack the Ripper, but if it was, the newspapers were somewhat unflattering about her, describing her as the worst woman in the square, and going on to say that at the police station she was very disorderly, end quote. By April 1888, Mary would once again return to the Lambeth Workhouse, and this time she would befriend a woman named Maryanne Monk. And to quote DJ Khaled, another one, another Maryanne. Yeah, you guys may be right, it may just be an extremely common name. In early May 1888, Mrs. Fielder, the matron of the workhouse, helped Maryanne get a job working as a domestic servant in the household of Samuel and Sarah Cowdrey. And from the Cowdrey's house, Maryanne wrote to her father, who she had not seen in 2 years, to tell him of her new situation, in which she seemed to have been quite happy. In this letter, Maryanne Nichols wrote, quote, "I just write to say you will be glad to know that I am settled in my new place, and going on alright up to now. My people went out yesterday, and have not returned, so I am left in charge. It is a grand place inside, with trees and gardens back and front. All has been newly done up. They are teetotalers and religious, so I ought to get on. They are very nice people, and I have not much to do. I hope you are alright and the boy has work. So goodbye for the present. From yours truly, Polly. Answer soon please, and let me know how you are." End quote. Edward Walker would then write back to his daughter Maryanne, but he would never get a response from her. And not because she ran into Twat the Ripper, but because she once again stole a bunch of shit and ran away. On July 12th, Edward got a postcard from Mrs. Sarah Cowdery, the lady Maryanne was working for, informing Edward that Maryanne had stolen clothing worth more than 10 shillings from her and disappeared. 10 shillings is like £3 today. Then there seems to be a big gap in time in which we're not quite sure what she did, but by August 1888, Maryanne Nichols had made her way to Gotham City, Whitechapel, the East End of London, where she moved into a place called Wilmot's, and even though that sounds like some sort of delightful Harry Potter shop, it was one of those 233 shitty common lodging houses. Although this one was a bit nicer, being female only and all, and it was located at 18 Thrall Street in Spitalfields. Yeah, thank you to the several comments pointing out it's pronounced Spitalfields. Here, Mary was known to the other residents as Polly. She then shared a room with 3 other women, one of whom was an elderly lady by the name of Emily Holland, that Mary became friends with, sort of. Emily would later go on to say that Mary was a very clean woman who kept herself to herself as if she was melancholy, and who gave the impression of being weighed down by some trouble. She also said that she had seen Mary the worse for drink once or twice, and also said that Mary never used to be fond of men, finally saying, "I don't think she was a fast woman." I think we know what she means. Anyway, then on August 24th, 1888, this is 1 week before her death, Mary left Wilmot and went to stay at a mixed-sex common lodging house known as the White House, and this one was located at 56 Flower and Dean Street in Spitalfields. This is where she would spend the last week of her life, but what she did during this week is quite unclear. However, the night of August 30th is a little easier to follow. Now that night, the East End of London was hit with heavy rain and a thunderstorm. Some of the homes near the Thames were flooded, and even more people were now made homeless. And to make things even worse, at about 9 p.m. that night, a fire broke out at a spirits warehouse in the East London docks. Firefighters rushed down to the dock to sort the fire out, and just as they put it out and said, quote, "Oh yeah mate, time for a point now innit?" another even bigger fire broke out at the Ratcliffe dry dock. Now guys, it's 1888. There was no YouTube, there was no Netflix, there wasn't even the book Dracula written by Bram Stoker. This is how fucking long ago it was. We're basically talking about the land before time here, so people had fuck all to do. Therefore, fires like this often drew big crowds of spectators. So many of the East Enders headed for the docks to go enjoy the spectacle. Among these spectators was Emily Holland. To be fair, when shit explodes and burns today, we can't really help but watch either. Even when things get stuck. Do you remember this shit? We'll watch this and make fucking jokes about it for days. Meanwhile, in the Frying Pan pub, Maryanne Nichols doesn't give a fuck about the fire and she sits there and has a drink. Once she finishes her drink, she leaves the bar and heads down Thrall Street to try to gain admission to Wilmot's. Why she decided to return to Wilmot's that night is unclear. It is later stated though that at this time, she was the worse for drink, but not drunk. However, since she didn't have the 4 pence to pay for her coffin bed, she was told by the deputy keeper that she couldn't stay there. Now, it's also been said that Mary was wearing a bonnet that none of the other residents had seen her with before. It was a new black velvet bonnet, ooh, fancy. And since she was probably planning to resort to prostitution in order to make this money so she can get into the common lodging house, she must have thought that this bonnet would be irresistible to potential clients, because as she left Wilmot's, she turned back and laughingly told the deputy keeper, quote, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now," end quote. Damn. Breaks my heart, man. She's in such a shitty situation, but she still seems to be so happy. Anyway, Mary then walks off into Gotham City to find her lodging money. Back to Emily Holland now. By 2 a.m., the fire in the docks had been put out, and Emily Holland then decided to make her way back to Wilmot's. As she was walking along Whitechapel Road, she passed the St. Mary's Church just as its clock chimed 2:30 a.m. Now, as she crossed over Whitechapel Road and turned into Osborne Street, she found a drunken Maryanne Nichols shambling around like a zombie. When Mary noticed Emily, she stopped walking and kind of fell against the shutters of a grocer's shop. And while leaning against this, she apparently told Emily that she had made her lodging money 3 times over, but had spent it. Emily, though, was quite worried about Mary being in this state and just wandering the streets, so she told her to come back with her to Wilmot's, and she would pay for Mary's bed. Mary, unfortunately, refused this offer, and she told Emily, quote, It won't be long before I'll be back." End quote. Well, it's technically been 137 years, because Mary would never make it back to Walmart's that night. Because what happens next, of course, is that Maryanne Nichols runs into Twat the Ripper. Now, why do some people think that Maryanne Nichols can be the key to solving this 137-year-old mystery? Well, it's because of who found Mary's remains. This guy, Charles Allen Leechmere. Now, Charles Allen Leechmere was born in Soho, London, and he was born to John Allen Leechmere and Marie Louisa Leechmere. When John Allen died, Marie married a police constable named Thomas Cross. Now, something important to remember is that Charles was known to still use the last name Leechmere, even though his mother married Thomas Cross. Just remember that. Now, according to Leechmere himself, on the night in question, he was on his way to work, walking down Bucks Row at about 3:40 a.m. And then he came across what he initially thought to be a tarpaulin, which is like a heavy-duty waterproof cloth, lying on the ground in front of a gated stable entrance. Now, upon inspecting the object, Charles discovered that the tarpaulin was actually the body of a woman. She lay on her back with her eyes open, her legs straight, and her skirt was raised almost over her waist. Sounds familiar? That sounds a little like Martha Tabram. Other than that, though, everything else is going to sound pretty fucking different. Then, at exactly 3:45 a.m., another cart driver named Robert Paul was walking down Bucks Row on his way to work as well when he saw Charles standing by the body. According to a report in the Evening Standard published September 3rd, 1888, Robert Paul himself said, quote, "It was bloody dark, mate, and I was hurrying along, right, when I saw this man, standing there where this woman was." I'm not going to do the whole thing like that. He says, "It was dark, I was hurrying along when I saw a man standing where the woman was. He came a little towards me, but as I knew the dangerous character of the locality, I tried to give him a wide berth. Few people like to come up and down here without being on their guard, for there are such terrible gangs about. There have been many knocked down and robbed at that spot. The man, however, came towards me and said, 'Come and look at this woman.' I went and found the woman lying on her back. I laid hold of her wrist and found that she was dead and the hands cold. It was too dark to see the blood about her. I thought that she had been outraged and had died in the struggle. I was obliged to be punctual at my work, so I went on and told the other man, who would have been Charles, I would send the first policeman I saw. I saw one in Church Row, just at the top of Bucks Row, who was going round calling people up, and I told him what I had seen. I asked him to come, but he did not say whether he should come or not. He continued calling people up, which I thought was a great shame, after I had told him the woman was dead. The woman was so cold that she must have been dead some time, and either she had been lying there, left to die, or she must have been murdered somewhere else and carried there. If she had been lying there long enough to get so cold as she was when I saw her, it shows that no policeman on the beat had been down there for a long time. If a policeman had been there, he must have seen her, for she was plain enough to see. Her bonnet was lying about 2 feet from her head." End quote. Well, that's what Robert Paul said, the man who stumbled upon the first canonical victim of Jack the Ripper. But what did Charles say? Well, it's a little different, but according to Charles, he was standing in the middle of the road when Robert approached him, not over the body. He then stepped back and waited for Robert to pass or whatever, because he explains that he was kind of like anticipating Robert to attack or rob him. The way it's recorded by someone listening to him speak at the inquest is like this, quote, "He stepped back and waited for the newcomer, who started on one side as if he feared that the witness meant to knock him down. The witness said, 'Come and look over here, there's a woman.'" End quote. Fair enough, what I can gather is that they both thought each other was going to rob each other. Gangs and crime was prevalent in Gotham City, Whitechapel. However, while stepping back and anticipating this attack, Charles still says, quote, "Come and look at this woman." Now that doesn't make much fucking sense to me, but perhaps it was like a distraction tactic. Like distract your mugger with a brutally mutilated body, and the robber's like, "What the fuck, dude? Fine, keep your shillings then." Well, whatever, I don't know. But Charles says that Robert grabbed her hands, and he said that they felt cold and they were limp, which is correct because Robert Paul also said that. And then Charles touches her face, which he said still felt warm. Robert then puts his hand on her chest to feel for her heart, I suppose to feel for a pulse and to make sure that she was dead. And keep this in mind because we know how dead Maryanne Nichols was. She was mutilated and disemboweled. But apparently, Charles said, Robert said, I think she's breathing, but it's very little if she is. He then suggested that they should shift her, meaning they should seat her upright, but then Charles said, I'm not going to touch her, despite the fact that they both already did touch her. And then because they both had to go to work, they agreed to tell the first police constable that they came across of the body. They then both pulled Maryanne Nichols' skirt down to cover her lower body, and they left. Charles would eventually come across Constable Misen in Baker's Row and tell him something to the effect of, You're wanted in Bucks Row, there is a woman back there. She looks to me either dead or drunk, but as for my part, I believe she's dead. Constable Jonas Misen then just said, all right. And this is where Constable Misen would put his fuck if he gave one. Right, so those are the two testimonies. Now, what is the big difference between Robert Paul's and Charles Leechmere's testimonies? Well, Charles's position when Robert Paul approached him. And that's pretty much all we have right now. But Charles does say some weird shit later, like the conversation between him and Constable Misen, for example. Now, this conversation between them has been subject of scrutiny and investigation since the actual murder happened all the way up until today. The fact of the matter is this. It is impossible to be absolutely 100% sure about what exactly Charles Leechmere said to Constable Misen. People say he lied to Constable Misen. Perhaps he did. So what is the debate about then? Well, when Charles Leechmere saw Constable Misen, he said, You're wanted in Bucks Row, there's a woman back there. But when Constable Misen got to the body, there was another constable there already, Constable John Neal. Keep in mind that Constable Neal happened to stumble across the body. But based on the circumstances of the situation, Constable Misen would not have known this. This all stems from the fact that in Constable Misen's testimony at the inquest, he claimed that Charles Leechmere said, You are wanted in Bucks Row by another policeman. There's a woman back there. However, several newspaper reports, not one, not two, several newspaper reports quote Leechmere as saying, You are wanted in Bucks Row, there is a woman there. So perhaps because Constable Misen got to the body and found Constable Neal there, how he remembered the actual conversation is Leechmere telling him, You're wanted in Bucks Row by another police constable, there is a woman there. Yeah man, this was such a big deal at the time that even a juryman asked Charles Leechmere, quote, Did you tell Constable Misen that another policeman wanted him in Bucks Row? Charles replied, No, because I did not see a policeman in Bucks Row. So just for the record, this is one of the lies people talk about when they're analyzing the suspect Charles Leechmere. Alright, let's get back to the investigation. Now, Constable Neal tried to alert another constable named John Thane by flashing his lantern and shouting, quote, Here's a woman with her throat cut. Run at once for Dr. Llewellyn. Constable Neal then inspected the crime scene to look for blood trails with his lantern. He apparently saw none. He also examined the road, but saw no marks of wheels. Constable Thane then fetched Surgeon Dr. Llewellyn, who arrived at Bucks Row at about 4 a.m. These doctors, man, are the real MVPs of the story because they get to the scene so fucking quickly. Okay, so now what did Dr. Lou think? Well, he observed that 2 deep knife wounds had been inflicted to Maryanne Nichols' throat. He concluded as well, through the fact that her body and legs were still warm, that she had been dead for approximately 30 minutes. He then ordered Constable Neal to remove the body and take her to the old Montague Street mortuary. The police then interview some people, but of course it's fairly uneventful obviously. But the thing to focus on is Dr. Lou's estimate that Maryanne Nichols had been dead for about 30 minutes. That means that either Charles almost caught the Ripper in the act, or Charles was the Ripper. Now this is assuming of course that Dr. Lou is correct. Touching the body to feel its temperature is not a foolproof method of determining how long someone has been dead, but it is all they had at the time and it's all they had to go on. And he's a doctor and he should know his shit, so let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Now after Maryanne's body was moved to the mortuary and her wounds were examined more carefully, Dr. Lou discovered that both sides of her face had been bruised by either a fist or the pressure of a thumb before the throat wounds had been inflicted from left to right. One of these throat wounds measured 8 inches in length and the other measured 4 inches in length, but both were so deep that they reached the back of a vertebral column. Her vagina had also been stabbed twice, and her abdomen had been mutilated with one deep, jagged wound 2 or 3 inches from the left side. Several more incisions had been inflicted across her abdomen, causing her bowels to protrude through the wounds. Fucking hell, man. Dr. Liu could determine that all of these wounds had been inflicted with the same knife, which he estimated to be at least 6 to 8 inches long or about 15 to 20 centimeters long, and possibly a cork cutter or a shoemaker's knife. Each wound had been inflicted in a violent and downward thrusting manner, and Dr. Liu was of the opinion that the murderer possessed some sort of anatomical knowledge. However, no organs were missing. I'll probably talk about this in the next episode, but at the time people used to steal organs to sell them. Yeah, nice. Dr. Liu then estimated the injuries would have taken 4 to 5 minutes to complete. And he also said that he was surprised at the small amount of blood found at the crime scene, which was about, quote, about enough to fill 2 large wine glasses, or a half pint at the outside, end quote. Dr. Liu also believed that Maryanne Nichols had been facing her attacker when he held his hand across her mouth before cutting her throat. Her death would have been almost instantaneous, and all her abdominal injuries were made by the killer after she was dead. Dr. Liu was able to determine this fact because the wounds inflicted to an individual's body after death do not result in blood spattering, and also sometimes don't result in an extensive amount of blood loss from the body. Well, that was rough, but we got through it. Now, at the time, folks, they had no idea whose body this was. So they examined her possessions and found her petticoats were marked Lambeth Workhouse. Although the deputy keeper was unable to identify the body, Maryanne Nichols' friend, Maryanne Monk, was able to positively ID her, as well as Emily Holland and even old William Nichols. Reportedly, when he confirmed Maryanne's identity, William said, quote, "I forgive you as you are for what you have been to me." End quote. Now, I'm not sure what the fuck that's supposed to mean, but the inquest into Maryanne's death began the very next day, and on the first day, only 3 witnesses testified. Edward Walker, Maryanne's father, Constable Neil, who discovered her body, and Dr. Liu. On the second day of the inquest, 5 people testified. Inspector John Spratling, horse slaughterer Harry Tompkins, Inspector Joseph Helson, Constable Jonas Meisen, and then Charles Allen Cross. Now, if you're wondering,
who in the blue hell are you?
Charles Allen Cross is Charles Allen Leechmere. Now, since he always went by the name Leechmere, it's unclear why, in this case, he decided to give the name of his police constable's stepfather instead. Now, this is either to conceal his identity, or perhaps to gain some sort of favor because his stepdad was a constable. That said though, if he did lie about his name because he had something to hide, i.e. he is Jack the fucking Ripper, it must be said and considered that he did give them his actual correct home address and place of employment, and he appeared at Maryanne's inquest on the second day. Now maybe he's just fucking clever. Maybe he did this to throw people off his tracks. Why would Jack the Ripper come to the inquest? Why would Jack the Ripper report a crime? Maybe he wasn't Jack the Ripper. Now, I know that people believe in him pretty seriously as a suspect, and I respect that. But to say that he's the killer because he lied about his surname when he actually gave them his real home address and his real place of employment, and to say that he's the killer because he found the body of the first canonical victim, is not enough. I know this is weird, but lots of people in the story stumble across dead bodies. That is how all of the victims get found in this story. But let's just carry on with the investigation. We'll come back to the suspects later. Now, it's hard to tell for sure, but Robert Paul seems to have testified on either September 2nd or September 3rd because his testimony was reported in the Evening Standard on September 3rd, 1888. So that would have been about the 3rd or the 4th day of the inquest. And I already told you what he said. Now let's jump ahead all the way to the final day of the inquest on September 22nd, where Coroner Wynne Edwin Baxter concluded that Maryanne Nichols' body appeared to prove conclusively that she had been murdered at the location where her body was found. Referring to the murderer's ability to escape detection, Baxter stated, quote, "It seems astonishing, at first thought, that the culprit should have escaped detection, for there must surely have been marks of blood about his person. If, however, blood was principally on his hands, the presence of so many slaughterhouses in the neighborhood would make the frequenters of the spot familiar with bloodstained clothes and hands, and his appearance might in that way have failed to attract attention while he passed from Bucks Row in the twilight into Whitechapel Road, and was lost sight of in the morning's market traffic." End quote. Now, it's important to mention that at this point in the timeline, on September 22nd, 1888, the next victim, the second canonical victim of Jack the Ripper, Annie Chapman, had already been murdered. So they do refer to some elements of that case in Maryanne Nichols' inquest. So during Maryanne's inquest, Coroner Baxter further referenced the two earlier Whitechapel murders, as well as the September 8th murder of Annie Chapman, informing the jury, quote, "We cannot altogether leave unnoticed the fact that the death you have been investigating is one of four presenting many points of similarity, all of which have occurred within the space of about 5 months, and all within a very short distance of the place where we are sitting. All four victims were women of middle age, all were married, and had lived apart from their husbands in consequence of intemperate habits, and were at the time of their death leading an irregular life." End quote. Then, referencing the direct similarities between Maryanne Nichols' murder and the murder of Annie Chapman, as opposed to the earlier murders of Emma Smith and Martha Tabram, Coroner Baxter said, quote, "The similarities of the injuries in the murders of Nichols and Chapman is considerable. There are bruises about the face in both cases. The head is nearly severed from the body in both cases. There are other dreadful injuries in both cases, and those injuries again have in each case been performed with anatomical knowledge. I suggest to you as a possibility that these two women may have been murdered by the same man with the same object." End quote. Coroner Baxter would then dismiss the possibility that Maryanne Nichols' murder was connected with the previous two Whitechapel murders, and he based that on the fact that the murder weapons used in all the cases were significantly different, and that neither of these victims had received slash wounds to the throat or any disembowelment. And that is all. Those are the two reasons that he thought these cases were not connected. So following a 20-minute deliberation, the jury, having been instructed to consider precisely how, when, and by what means Nichols came about her death, they returned a verdict of, quote, "willful murder against some person or persons unknown," end quote. Now, pretty soon after her murder, the press started printing crazy stories about the police commissioner Charles Warren, saying that the Metro Police Force were unhappy with him. Now, we're going to talk about these motherfuckers in future episodes because the press were completely full of shit. However, they still ran with the story that all these murders were done by a single serial killer, and rumors began to spread around Whitechapel that a local Jewish man known as Leather Apron may have been responsible for these murders. Now, even though Leather Apron sounds like some sort of shitty DC villain, like a Z-grade villain that wasn't even cool in the 1930s, he surprisingly was a real guy. And apparently he carried a knife on him all the time and frequently intimidated local prostitutes. Therefore, the press, being the scum of the earth that they were, started printing crude Jewish stereotypes of Leather Apron, blaming him for the murder of Maryanne Nichols. Now, Leather Apron was actually a guy named John Pizer, a Polish Jew who made footwear from leather. Despite there being no direct evidence against him except for maybe the speculation that the knife Jack the Ripper used to kill Maryanne Nichols was some sort of shoemaker's knife, John Pizer was still arrested on September 10th on suspicion of Maryanne Nichols' murder. The police then searched his home and they found 5 long-bladed knives. Shocking. He works with leather, he presumably cooks and eats as well, but Pizer was soon released after that when his alibis were confirmed for the nights of the 2 most recent Whitechapel murders. I'm glad they released him, because that's just fucking crazy. He later also successfully obtained monetary compensation from at least one newspaper that had named him the murderer, so good for him. And that's about it for Maryanne Nichols. That's all I have to say about that. Okay, so let's recap. Now, as I mentioned at the start of episode 1, I'm covering the idea presented by Dr. Frederick Walker that Joseph Barnett, the last boyfriend of final Ripper victim Mary Jane Killer, might have possibly been Jack the Ripper. The reason I chose this theory is because I find this theory in particular quite interesting. And also because I haven't heard it 1,000 fucking times already. That said though, I know that there are thousands of suspects and everyone has a different theory. In fact, the reason this video took so long to come out after the first part is because of all the comments I got saying Charles Allen Leechmere was Jack the Ripper. So I spent some time reading up about this guy. So for everyone unfamiliar with the Charles Leechmere theory, the theory is that Robert Paul, the second person to arrive at the scene, did not just stumble upon the man who stumbled upon Jack the Ripper's first canonical victim, but he actually interrupted Jack the Ripper while he was killing Maryanne Nichols. And he wasn't just standing and looking at the body, but he was trying to cover up some of the wounds. So when Leechmere heard Robert Paul's footsteps approaching, Leechmere had to think quickly. And so rather than fleeing the scene and potentially drawing suspicion to himself as the killer, he chose to instead do nothing and pretend to be paralyzed with shock. That again comes directly from jacktheripper.org. Furthermore, some authors suggest all but one of the murders occurred between his home and his place of work. Now, we know his home address because he gave his actual and correct home address to the police at Maryanne's inquest, which was 22 Doveton Street, Bethnal Green. And that is where Charles lived for approximately 20 years with his wife and children. And he worked for a place called Pickford's as a delivery man. Before we go on, if you believe that Charles Allen Leechmere was Jack the Ripper, that's cool with me. I'm not against the theory, and I'm not here to tell you otherwise. I've spent some time reading up on this guy, which is why this video took so long to come out, and I personally am not really convinced. So if you don't mind, I'm going to share some people's opinions on why Leechmere might not be Jack the Ripper, and I'm also going to ask some rhetorical questions that I have. Please keep in mind that I'm not trying to be an asshole. I just have that kind of voice because I'm South African. We're known to have these sort of blunt baritone voices. I'm not trying to be a dick. Okay, my first question is this. Why is a man who is not afraid to literally eviscerate a human being in public too afraid to run away when he has footsteps approaching him from 40 yards or 36 meters away? We need to remember that Mary's wounds were not visible to these guys while they were literally in arm's reach of her. Robert Paul was holding her by her wrists, and he couldn't see that her throat was slit. That is how dark it was. There is no way in hell that Robert Paul could have come down Bucks Row and seen this man's face from 36 meters away. Charles could have easily run away and been fine. Robert Paul would have never been able to identify him, but he instead just stood there. Maybe he was just fucking stupid. My second question is, if Charles Leechmere was in fact the Ripper, why did he tell Constable Misen about Maryanne's body that he just killed back in Bucks Row? He could have just walked past Misen and just said, "Hello, lovely morning innit?" or whatever. But he told him about the woman back there that he presumably just killed. Also, he did not give Constable Misen his name on the street. Constable Misen would have never fucking known who this guy was. As a matter of fact, no one did for years because he got away with giving a false name. So it's pretty safe to assume that he would have gotten away with not showing up for the inquest as well. But he did show up for it anyway, on the second day. Maybe Charles was just fucking stupid. My third question is, why would he then attend the inquest on the second day? And then give them his real home address and his place of employment? I do agree that it's weird and suspicious that he gave them a different surname, but he still gave them his real home address. If they needed him again, they could have found him. It's also important to point out that some people who present this theory say that Charles refused to go to the inquest and it took about 2 weeks for him to get there, which is not true at all. He was there on the second day. He testified before Robert Paul did. So you've got to be mindful that some of the reasons people say this guy is, probably the Ripper, have been manipulated. And these facts are false. My fourth question is, was he just killing people on the way to work? What if he got blood all over his clothes and hands? Well, some people say that he could have been a delivery man. Well, more specifically, a meat delivery man. Interestingly, there is fuck all evidence suggesting that. There is evidence, though, that in 1901, he became a railway agent carman, and then he started his own business as a grocer. But there is literally nothing about meat. Because that makes fucking sense. Was meat delivered unpackaged in the 1800s? Was it typical for delivery men of meat to be covered in fresh blood? Now, I'm not going to pretend I know the answers because I don't, but that still sounds pretty fucking stupid to me. So this guy arrives at work, presumably covered in blood. A murder has just happened, people are talking about it, news is spreading, news reports are coming out, but nobody remembers, oh, Charles, the delivery guy, he takes that road to work, that's where the woman was murdered, he came to work covered in blood. He might be the guy that did it, let's report that to the police. That seems to be a pretty easy connection to make, but that never happened. Charles Leechmere was never questioned about the Whitechapel murders. And my final question is this. Let's say that this was Charles's close call to being caught, and he froze and he got scared when he heard Robert Paul's footsteps in the dark. Why did he then proceed to kill 4 more women and then just suddenly stop after Mary Jane Kelly? Also, why did he suddenly switch up his MO with the murder of Mary Jane Kelly? She was the only prostitute killed indoors, and her murder was by far the most violent and gruesome. Surely he doesn't walk through her apartment on his way to work. So what happened there? Now, this is where some people say, oh, Mary Jane Kelly might not have actually been a Jack the Ripper victim, because her death is so different to the other ones. Fair enough. What about Elizabeth Stride then? Burner Street, where she was killed, is by no means close to his home or on a logical route from his home to his work. Now, to assume that Charles Leechmere was the Ripper, it does help to discount Elizabeth Stride as a Ripper victim. And again, this is the problem with the Jack the Ripper mystery. It is impossible to tell for sure which murders were committed by Jack the Ripper or just some other fucking idiot or even a copycat. We don't have a fucking clue about what happened here. It's all guesswork and neatly arranging cherry-picked details to suit the narrative of who your favorite suspect is. We're basically like the doctors from the 1800s. We're just touching the skin to see how warm it is to determine how valid this theory is. But that is the only way that we can try to make sense of the Jack the Ripper case. We have no other options. Because there is no evidence, everything is circumstantial, and because of that, we kinda have to look for patterns. In the case of Leechmere, the pattern is that most of the victims were killed on this route he would have taken to work. And that puts him at the scene of the crime for a lot of the murders, which is important. And factually, he was only ever spotted at one crime scene, Maryanne Nichols' crime scene. So those are just some thoughts and opinions on Charles Leechmere as a suspect. If you disagree, fine, fair enough. I'd agree that he's pretty weird, but the circumstantial evidence against him is kinda weak. But that's true for all the Jack the Ripper victims, I guess. Anyway, Leechmere became a big suspect in 2014 when a journalist named Krista Holmgren and a criminologist named Gareth Norris made the documentary Jack the Ripper: The Missing Evidence. In 2021, Holmgren then produced a book which accuses Leechmere of not only committing the Whitechapel murders, but also the Thames Torso murders. Don't worry, I'll cover that in this series as well. Now, David McNabb, the producer of the documentary I just mentioned, said, quote, "The man who committed these crimes would have been a local. He would have been able to blend into the background and walk the streets without being detected. Leechmere was discovered standing over the body, but bizarrely, no one seemed to think that this was an important fact. I am totally convinced that we have found Jack the Ripper." End quote. Again, I'm not trying to be a dick here, but Charles Leechmere was only found standing by the body. He wasn't mutilating it, he wasn't stabbing it, he wasn't strangling her, he wasn't even caught in the actual act of ripping her. And like I said, several people in the story report seeing or stumble upon the victims' bodies. That's how they're found. One thing that I will say that's a point in favor of Charles Leechmere being the Ripper is that Dr. Llewellyn, who examined Mary Nichols' body, said that he believed it would have taken about 5 minutes to complete the mutilations done to her body. Now, interestingly, in Charles Leechmere's testimony, he said he was walking down Bucks Row and found Maryanne Nichols at 3:40 a.m. Robert Paul reported finding Charles Leechmere at 3:45. So, was this guy just staring at the body for 5 minutes? Or was he doing something else, like mutilating her? Or did he just round off the time that he was walking down Bucks Row? Was it like 3:43, but he was just like, yeah, it was 3:40. I don't know, man. I'm not gonna say that it wasn't Charles Leechmere, but a lot of things in that theory just don't make sense to me. Doesn't mean it's wrong. I could just be a fucking idiot. Well guys, we are approaching the end of this video, and since I said this series is gonna cover the idea that the Ripper might have been Joseph Barnett, how does he fit into the murder of Maryanne Nichols? Well, admittedly only with very, very, very weak circumstantial evidence. His room would have been about less than a mile away from the crime scene, about an 18-minute walk. So if he was kicked out of the room so Mary Jane could work, and he was wandering the streets, he's kind of in walking distance. Also, apparently according to Dr. Frederick Walker, the blood drops at the crime scene led west, which would be towards Joseph Barnett's room. I do realize that Constable Neal said that when he was at the scene he did not see any blood drops, but it was dark and he was there with a fucking lantern, so he could have missed the blood drops. So that's it for Maryanne Nichols. The evidence against Barnett is very fucking weak. But in the last video, I did show you this very peculiar pattern of the name Maryanne repeating in the list of victims. Of course, you have to use a mixture of the ladies' real names and their aliases. Also worth noting, I suppose, is the name Elizabeth or Eliza pops up a few times. Now, I didn't make it clear, but the names are highlighted in blue, Elizabeth or Eliza, are considered to not be Jack the Ripper murders. The red ones, the Maryannes, are considered to be Jack the Ripper murders. Now, we have discounted Elizabeth Stride. We are cheating, but canonically, she is recognized as a Ripper victim. But there is evidence to suggest that she might not be. Now, when I first saw this in Dr. Frederick Walker's dissertation, I thought, it's just sort of weird. Like, is it just a coincidence, like every woman in the world that wants to talk to the manager is named Karen? Is it that kind of coincidence? Maybe. And a lot of you guys said that it is just a coincidence, and you're probably right. Well, then I found out that Martha Tabram's alias was Emma. And now I'm just starting to think that everybody in Whitechapel has the same fucking name. So I decided to waste a little bit of time and make a list of every person's name that I've mentioned in this story so far. This is just people that I have mentioned so far in this episode and the previous episode, so we can compare that list of names to the list of names of the victims. Because I agree, at the time Mary, Maryanne, Elizabeth, these kind of names were exceptionally common. It's not, however, everyone's name in Whitechapel. The fact that these women are all prostitutes and all share something in common suggests that these are not random attacks, but instead they're targeted. I just want to point out again that I did not come up with this theory, I just find it very interesting. So is Dr. Frederick Walker full of shit, or is this weird? So I'm just going to leave these two lists of names up on the screen for you to decide for yourself. It could be nothing, it could be something. Dr. Walker says, quote, "All victims, real and intended, are named Mary, Ann, or Maryanne. 2 are actually named Maryanne Kelly." He's referring to Catherine Eddowes telling the police her name is Maryanne Kelly. Recent genealogical evidence published in Ripperana suggests that Ann was Mary Kelly's real middle name, and not an alias. Only Joseph Barnett is likely to have known that at the time. And added to the coincidence of the addresses, he's referring to a piece of paper with an address on it found in the hands of Annie Chapman, which I will get to in the next episode. The coincidence of the names suggests that somebody was obsessed with Maryanne Kelly, the Dorset Street whore, and killing her again and again until he finally killed the real one. And then he just stopped. End quote. So, is Dr. Walker just full of shit? A lot of people seem to think that he is. Anyway guys, I'm going to have to call it here. Some people ask, why do you need to do this in episodes? Why don't you just release a 5-hour video? Do you hear how my voice sounds right now? Talking repeatedly for hours on end into a microphone does some damage to your vocal cords.
Journey is usually the part that you remember anyways.
So anyway, I'm going to call it here. Next time we're going to cover the murder of Annie Chapman as well as the double event, and we're going to finally solve who exactly sent in the infamous Dear Boss letter. Spoiler alert, it was not Jack the Ripper. Yep, the Dear Boss letter has been debunked. One of 3 letters that have been thought to be authentic and from the Ripper himself was proven to be a fraud. Next time we'll see how that impacts the story, and until then, let me know your thoughts in the comment section, like the video, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in part 3. Thanks for watching.